I think it's this whole package of not trusting the elites, of sensing a certain sense of elitism, of superiority, where people feel that they are no longer addressed in the way they want to be addressed. Mm-hmm. And I think this whole package plays very nicely and dangerously together.
Hello, welcome to our Common Concerns podcast. I'm Xiang Biao, a co-director of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, Germany. This podcast is part of our research agenda of developing the so-called the Common Concerns approach. With the Common Concerns approach, our research is not only about talking about our interlocutors, but we try to talk to our interlocutors. At the end of the research, we will go back to our interlocutors, tell them what we researchers find out from the research data, what kind of concepts, theories, perspectives that we developed, and what kind of new questions we may raise. The interlocutors listen to us and say, these questions are what have been worrying me for quite a while. But I have never got the time or the particular perspectives to look at them in this way. Therefore, these concepts help me to look at my life, my circumstances slightly differently, probably more clearly. And therefore, I can think, perhaps I can do something about my life in the circumstances that I'm in, even though I cannot change the circumstances itself. We propose the Common Concerns approach because we realized that the social context in which we are doing research is very different from even 20 years ago. The massification of higher education worldwide, and especially in the global south, means that our public is much better educated than before. And also, the advancement in communication technology means they have unprecedented access to information and also unprecedented freedom, at least the technically defined freedom, to express their opinions. They, especially the young, have many questions about their life. And they want to think for themselves. They do not necessarily want to have some quick answers or solutions from experts. What they demand instead is kind of thinking tools, concepts, perspectives, and more systemic analysis that will help them to think about what they have been worried in their life in their own way. Therefore, the Common Concerns approach is ideally an exercise that we will think together, research together with our interlocutors. Now we are still at a very early stage of developing this, or rather experimenting this approach. And in our institute, in our department, my colleagues and I bang our heads to think how we should move forward and how this approach can be applied, tested, and developed in specific cases. And we also engage our colleagues nearby as well as far away to think together. So today I'm very pleased. I have my friend and also neighbor, Professor Olaf Zenker, whose office is just across the street from the University of Halle, to join me to discuss about his work as well as the Common Concerns approach. Olaf, welcome. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Biao. Thank you very much also for having me.
Yeah, to start, Olaf, could you please tell us what your research is about in general?
Sure. Well, I work in various fields, but they are mostly related to questions of what I describe as justice and contested normativities. Mm-hmm. I work in various fields regionally, mostly in Southern Africa and South Africa, but also in Germany and in Northern Ireland. I did research in the past. To give you an example, in the Southern African context, I've been mostly studying the state-driven land reform process after the end of apartheid, which is an attempt by the state to reinvent itself and undo colonial injustice and dispossessions that happened.
In the late 1990s, the reform...
Well, the process started quite immediately after the end of apartheid in 1994. And I'm really interested in how this opens up a kind of lens or an optic to investigate questions of contested normativities, because, of course, constitutional laws involved state law related to property and land reform, but also various forms of customary law, the living law of communities on the ground, state-recognized versions of customary law, and so on. So I'm really interested in how these different normative expectations, soft law, legalistic understandings really intersect in practice when people try to struggle with the past they inherited.
I think you're talking about contested normativities, and then you mentioned there's constitutions and the state laws and the customers and probably everyday normative understandings. But so this is a different embodiment or expressions of normativity, different forms of laws and customers. But are you also looking at just some substantive claims that they are contesting each other? For instance, people define what is fair, what is just differently.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm really interested and have studied for the past 15 years or so the land restitution process, which is one particular version of the state-driven land reform, because here we have directly competing claims about what rightful shares and inheritance property should be. So the state defined after the end of apartheid that everyone who was dispossessed of land rights since 1913 is entitled to restitution, right? And it included all kinds of land rights, not only private property, but also customary law, beneficial occupation, and so on. So communities and individuals could lodge claims to the state in order to get the land restituted.
Based on some historical record.
Exactly. And also on the basis of anthropological research, actually, because many of these land claims do not have any paper trail. They are informal rights. So they have to be proven in court by expert testimonies and so on. And then the interesting battle between different normativities unfold, because there's an understanding of the state of how to deal with this. There's the normative understanding of the current landowners. There's the expectations of the claimant communities. And then you come to a result. There's a certain court order. Sometimes it goes up to the next level, to the Supreme Court of Appeal, for instance, or even the Constitutional Court. And then it needs to be implemented. And through all these chains of interaction, people make their different normativities visible, stake their claims, and then see how they win or lose and what they make with it. And I'm really interested in how people experience this as a form of doing justice to them, but maybe also feeling that they are not sufficiently seen or treated unfairly, that the state is conducting a kind of victor's justice, for instance. So there's also a lot of resentment unfolding. I'm really interested in how people position themselves towards these claims on land and what imageries they have about justice and entitlements, right?
Wow. That is very interesting. Olaf, I must say, I know all of the topics that you work on, but this is my first time to hear in such a level of details. And then what is the overall impression? Because there's two possible scenarios. Number one, it is a really energizing process, especially immediately after the apartheid. And then, everyone can make a claim, and the state provide a platform for all kind of different understanding of normativity. So people, it's a genuine democratic process because it's not engineered, programmed democracy, but it's democracy that everyone can debate about something that is fundamental to them. And the second scenario you also alluded to, it is chaos. It is confusing, and it's full of disappointment and bitterness and resentment. That would lead a conclusion, probably a more conservative end, to say, the state, you can provide an open platform, but you still have to put some very clear guideline or framework in order for the collective discussion to take place in a productive way. So is there any lesson that you think you learned from that research?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, the question you raise is crucially important. And in fact, that's exactly the kind of meta-discussion that has been unfolding in South Africa over the past 10, 15 years, really. Because as you will know, South Africa in the 1990s was really celebrated as the kind of poster child of progressive liberal constitutionalism. South Africa was seen as having one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. Radical transformation was envisioned and hoped for through the mechanism of the law. And there has been a lot of change, but the change has been perceived widely and rightly so, I think, to be too slow and not comprehensive enough. So there's a kind of a rise and fall of the excitement about the law. Mark Goodale and I recently did a volume on that question, also Reckoning with Law in Excess, where it's really about the kind of frequency, the tides of investment in the law, what people hope the law can achieve. And for a long time in South Africa, the law was really seen as the primary mechanism to achieve social justice and transformation. And there's more and more criticism unfolding. And I must say, as a researcher and as a political person, I'm a bit skeptical about the way how this is being framed, because I feel a lot of criticism that's being pointed at the law right now is actually more a question of implementation, a lack of political will, an unwillingness of the ruling party to invest sufficient resources to make this process happen. This is not to say that the law is the perfect mechanism, but I think it's a very complex picture. And we've had a recent debate, and maybe you're interested, we can talk about that also in more detail, on a constitutional amendment to allow for expropriation without compensation. That was something that was pitched in 2018 and then went through the constitutional process. It failed ultimately, but it's still a hot topic. And that was precisely the question here. Is the Constitution the problem? Is the property clause the problem of why justice is not unfolding to the extent hoped for? And can this be changed by amending the Constitution? And there was a quite wide range of positions on that issue. And it's very interesting to see what people motivate and bring to the table when they think about how to better achieve radical transformation. There are, of course, also social movements that think we should just occupy the land, forget about compensation, just take it back, right? Like in Zimbabwe 20 years ago or so. So there's a lot of unfolding here, and I think this is precisely the dynamics I'm interested in. What are people's hopes and expectations? What's the temporality of it? How long does it take? How long do people have patience? When does hope turn into despair and disillusionment?
Wow. And so far, your story sounds to me as a story of how democracy can become mature. As you mentioned, the beginnings are lots of excitement and a utopia, vision, and then a strong faith in law. But in time, people learned, okay, law is important, but as you said, there's a political will, there is a cultural understanding, and then there's also social processes of communication, and it just takes time for people to learn to compromise and etc. So this is. And probably it probably means this is how actually functioning democracy should be. You have a clear framework, but also you have a space for all the kind of messy everyday interactions. But then I understand you also work on something that a mature democracy became like a teenager contestations, which is in a German context. And so I understand that you have been quite worried about the some trends in the European democracy. Can you share with us your observation?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, partly I think it's really related also to the research in South Africa, because what I've been seeing there for a long time unfolding is a certain kind of fatigue or disillusionment with certain elements of liberal democracy, liberal constitutionalism. And in the Southern context, of course, it's very strongly framed also in post-colonial, decolonial terms. So very often the law is criticized also as being a neo-colonial Western transplant, right? But interestingly, many of the arguments put forward by neo-traditionalists, by culturalist movements in South Africa echo strongly with kind of arguments we hear here from the right, populist argumentations. And there are also similar arguments about nativism, of people being more autochthonous than others, of him being indigenous to local contexts. And I find it really interesting to compare these kind of arguments and motivations, because the phenomenology, if you want to call it that way, is quite similar. But of course, the context is quite different. And that, I think, raises very interesting questions, how we should position ourselves to these questions also politically, because I think anthropology is not only there to admire the problem, it's really about dealing with common concerns and trying to find solutions to improve the situation.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think that is also a key contribution that anthropology can make, namely making unlikely comparison, right? I mean, there is something actually deep down. There's something we can, there are commonalities, but on the surface they appear to be completely different. But when you put the South African scenario with the European or German scenario together, you look at this kind of claim based on nativism and some primordial identity. I belong here, so therefore I have the rights and etc. Is any hypothesis or some hypothetical insights you want to develop? You think both of them indicate a certain dynamics or trend?
Well, I guess we've been discussing that beforehand also, what the overall topic of this podcast could be, or what the common concern is that I'm really thinking about a lot. And for me, this is really the kind of framing of that situation, the global conjuncture, really, in terms of what I would describe as post-liberalism. Because I think we've moved out of an era which was maybe at its height in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, where people like Francis Fukuyama could proclaim that we have reached the end of history. Liberalism has won. I think we are no longer in that situation. I think in many places, liberalism is under attack, in Germany, in South Africa, in China, in Brazil, in other contexts. And what I find really interesting is that it invites us to become more nuanced in our analytical questions that we ask, and in trying to tease out how local concerns translate into politics and what kind of impact they do have. So I think it's really a moment in which what I would describe as a post-liberal affordance, the moment affords to us the possibility to ask more nuanced and more specific questions about what it is that needs to be defended, maybe about the political project of liberalism. But obviously, what is also very critical about liberalism, actually existing liberalisms over the past 300 years has been very oppressive, very colonial, very biased, with many double standards. So how can we really navigate that? And I think that's a moment in which we need to defend our political system, the values that we are standing for, but also try to speak and engage with the people that we study and hear what is really driving us. I mean, as you were pointing out in the beginning, what are the common concerns of the people? And how can we make sense of them, and how can we make them politically productive?
Yes. And I understand that you told me earlier that you actually see quite a few common concerns emerging from your research. But now I can't help but asking one, which I don't remember whether you mentioned before, but you just mentioned during our conversation now, which is about the fatigue about liberalism and the sense of disappointment. And the fatigue and disappointment, I think, implies at least two things. Number one, they do not reject the content, the principle itself, but they feel they just get tired of it. They feel it is not working. So therefore, they want something else. But then it also, I feel curious. Okay, if you're just tired of something, you feel fatigue of something, and you don't have to go to the opposite of it. You don't have to go to the authoritarian or far right in order to express that you're tired of liberalism. So I don't know, I mean, can you unpack of this kind of a feeling of fatigue or resentment about the actual existing the classical liberalism that was in place for 200 years?
I think that's a big question. I mean, that's probably a question I will not be able to answer comprehensively here, of course. But I think that is an invitation to all of us to really study in much more detail today. I think what is really interesting about these moments of fatigue is the fatigue is relational to the extent of hopes and expectations that you had. So if you, in the South African context, for instance, if you experience 350 years of colonialism, massively obstructive with apartheid, incredible suffering, state-driven, law-based oppression, there's, of course, the momentum and hope that now finally freedom will prevail, right? The long walk to freedom, as Mandela wrote it in his autobiography, right? So I think the expectation was there that finally all this oppression will go away and we will quickly reach a state of equality, right? And then the question, of course, is to what an extent is that realistic? How long does it take to undo 350 years of colonialism? And is it really the mechanisms that are at play that are possibly the wrong tools? Do we have to shift the tools? Or do we have to shift our temporal expectations or scale down our hopes? And I think this is an open question that is precisely the concern that people have when they are struggling with the fatigue. Should we pursue the avenues that we have had? Is this mechanism
be more patient?
Working? Do we need to be more patient? Do we have to, or do we vote for different parties that put more radical transformation on the menu? Or do we have to go into other directions? And what I observe in South Africa, what I observe in Germany and in other places, I think is a global trend to jump possibly too rapidly into a kind of sense of fatigue, which often then also the notion of crisis is sometimes it's a situation in which you feel it's not working the way you imagine, but that therefore something else has to be done. There's this elseness, this otherwise, right?
Okay.
And the question is, when is the otherwise the wise position to take, and when is persistence the right position to take? And I think we are in a moment, in a conjuncture, where we are no longer enduring a kind of height sense of we are on top of things. We are riding the wave, so to speak, but rather we are being overturned. We are struggling. We are not getting along in the way we could.
Okay.
And I think this is very productive and fruitful politically, but it can lean in vastly different directions. We have been at these points of time in history before. If we think about Germany in the 20s, early 30s of the last century, there was also a strong sense of fatigue with Weimar Democratic Republic.
Yes.
And the hope that a strong leader would come and solve these problems. So I think this is precisely the interesting, uncanny bit of it.
No, I think it's very interesting because the disappointment sometimes can be more damaging than anger. I cannot articulate why, but I think as a disappointment, you feel kind of in a sense of emptiness, feel lost and feel confused, and therefore probably you have a certain psychological need for a new direction. And anger probably implies that you know that is wrong and you know something else in deep down is correct. So it's not like confused. Empathy can be easily led or misled to different directions. But then, Olaf, it sounds to me that your diagnosis of the current moment remains not that pessimistic, because you said it's just the moment of transition, as you put it. Actually, you use the word affordance. I mean, for the audience who are not familiar with that, it is a moment you open up new possibilities and you can do something that otherwise you'll be not pay so much attention to, or you feel less urgent. But now there is actually our intellectual labor should be energized at this moment. Is that correct, your diagnosis?
That's right. But it's also a kind of, if you want, political intervention, because I sense a lot of despair and fatigue also within the academic community, a certain sense of lack of orientation, a certain worry. How can we deal with this whole situation? A lack of control. And I think we actively have to craft a more energetic and agentic perspective towards it. How can we make use of the situation in ways that project it as an affordance, right? So in that sense, I think it is a chance also to rethink both our own discipline and the work we've been doing. I mean, I think that's a conversation you and I have been having over the years. How can anthropology be more publicly relevant? How do we address concerns that matters to people beyond the academy? And I think we can do that. I think there's much more room for maneuver than we have been using so far. So I'm really also actively trying to make that point. Hey, let's understand this moment as one in which there are also chances and not only risk, because there's this kind of, as we talked about, this kind of sense of downfall, of despair, of losing the grip. And maybe if I can connect to that also, I think it's really also related to different imaginations of relationality and sociability, because I think the sense of fragmentation that is related to despair is different from anger. I think anger is directed. You stay in contact. You are still in conversation. Whereas despair is somehow unspecified. You don't have an addressee. You're kind of fragmented and left on your own. And I think what we need to do is to recraft connections and conversations, even if they are in anger and they are in confrontation, but stay with the trouble, so to speak, and stay in conversation and communication with each other.
Yeah, I really like the point. So, we articulate, and therefore people know what they are angry about, rather than just feel completely lost. And whoever speaks loudest and whoever appear to be most charismatic will have the chance to lead the rest of us. And I know it's of course, it's a very volatile and sensitive situation, but now I can't help but asking, how are you doing that? I mean, so you feel that particular type of topics or particular style of research is most needed in order to make good use of this post-liberal affordance? Or do you want to revive particular type of theory? Or
Well, I think it's not that far away from what you described in the beginning of the common concerns approach, to really try to start. I mean, I think this is standing in the best of the traditions of our discipline, to really center the needs and concerns of the people we study. What is really the issues for them?
Mm-hmm.
But then maybe take it together with them to a different level and think about how can we productively think about this to not only admire the problem, but really to come towards better solutions. So for instance, to give you practical examples from South Africa, one of the cases of land reform that I've been studying is a quite famous case that was early case law in the restitution process, where white landowners got a claim against them, and they held the land and title deed in private property since the late 19th century, right? But as I said earlier, in land restitution, dispossession must have happened after 1913. So a claimant community claimed against these landowners and said, well, we have had informal land rights, customary law land rights in this piece of land, and we want to get it back. So the white landowners opposed this claim in court because we said, well, we can prove here we have the title deed since 1872. How could this piece of land have been dispossessed after 1913 if private property means the most comprehensive and the strongest right in land you can have? But they lost, right? Because the reasoning in the jurisprudence was to say, well, yes, in conventional property logic, this is the case. But land restitution is a form of redress, a transitional justice measure in which we take a balanced case-by-case evaluation of the situation. And private property, even though conventionally understood as the strongest sense of ownership you can have, does not, in our reasoning today, trump other informal rights in land if circumstances justifies that. So now the current landowners, the former landowners who were dispossessed then, felt deeply resentful about this because they said, how could this be possibly the case? Because private property by definition is the strongest right in land and we possessed it before 1913. Well, part of the research I'm doing and part of the conversation I'm having is to say, well, but you need to understand what land restitution is doing, what the jurisprudence, the legal theory of contemporary restitution is doing, so that you don't feel resentful. Because what they are doing is trying to remedy the acts of dispossession that occurred at the time. It's not conventional property restitution as if you're taking my car and then I go to court and say he stole my car, right? So it's a different property logic. So the hope is at least that if we do informed research and bring together different normativities and make them more intelligible, that there's a chance for a stronger connection in society again, because people do not deviate into their fragmented communities of resentment, so to speak, and then eternally just circulate their own stories of the state is doing this evil, bad thing to me, but not really understanding what is really the logic behind it.
Okay. Now I understand better why these contested normativities are important, because it's not only an object that you describe, but by engaging with multiple normativity at the same time, you also bring them together into conversation. And so therefore, you can have not a consensus, but at least become communicatable to each other.
Exactly.
But then it leads to a question, Olaf, because this white landowner, probably he was, he has a good reason to feel unhappy at that time, but he could be informed, and it seems that he was open to at least your interpretation. But also now we see the world is becoming very divided and very fragmented. And to the extent that people feel can no longer communicate with each other, because people not only disagree with each other on opinions, people disagree on facts, whether or not something happened or not. They cannot. So then basically it becomes, many people feel impossible. We know even friendship broken down, and sometimes even family relations are affected. It's I was in the UK during Brexit, that happened already, and then in the US and in Germany too. But we know that anthropologists we are almost the specialists, the professional to bridge different opinions, could do engage with someone who may be radically different from us. If that's happened at the cultural level, people say, "Oh, good, we can do that." When it happened at the ideological and the political level, it becomes naturally very difficult, very thorny, because you may be accused by your colleagues about spend too much time with someone that regarded as deeply problematic. But I think you have been very brave, working together with students or colleagues to engage someone normally academics don't listen to very carefully. And how do you navigate that? what I think you call as the normative others.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, that's an issue that I've been thinking about a lot lately because of the political developments we find ourselves in. I think there might be a tendency in anthropology, partly also due to our methodological inclination to do long-term fieldwork with people, stay in very intimate contexts and so on, to prefer to study people that, even if they are culturally different, we somehow like.
Yes.
What we describe with a colleague, Mario Kremer, and I, in a piece we are currently publishing, normative friends. People whose political project we can affiliate with, we can support, which we feel a sense of allyship. So it doesn't necessarily have to be people like us, but people who are at least politically inclined in certain ways that we like. So when I do research in South Africa, naturally I'm interested in dispossessed African communities and I want them to get their land back, right? So I have a certain normative engagement. Or when I did research in Northern Ireland, I was doing research with Irish Catholics who I felt and shared their opinion were oppressed, colonized people for 800 years, right? So there's a tendency to do research maybe with people we normatively affiliate with. But I think there's also a need to better understand people we might not normatively feel so many commonalities with. First of all, to better understand what motivates them, what drives them. But also partly because research is performative, like engaging each other shows I'm taking you seriously. I'm interested in how you see the world and what makes you drive. Why do you think the world is the way you see it? And are there ways for us to bridge, right? I mean, if you think in the history of anthropology, like a classical topic like witchcraft, right? Evans Pritchard studying the Azande or so, right? It's really about trying to make intelligible why would people believe in witches if obviously witches do not exist. I mean, that was the reasoning at the time, right? So it's really about making the amic rationalities intelligible in order to create more senses of commonality so that we can at least say, I understand why you think what you're doing. And I think we are trying to do that here and many other colleagues as well, I guess, especially also with normative others in the region, with people who are sympathizing with the AfD, maybe, with people who are voting for the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, which is a kind of left-right populist movement too. Trying to understand anti-vaccination activists who are against the COVID measures that were put into place, to really get an understanding of why do they think what they are doing, what drives them, and are there ways of bringing each other in contact again to foster more conversation and a stronger societal integration. I think that's also a performative duty that anthropologists have.
Yeah, the performative duty is very interesting. I'll come back to that later. But before that, can you tell us what's your observation so far? What is the common concern of these people who probably appear to be, completely the friends or neighbors as we expect, but suddenly when we talk about politics, they surprise us about their inclination and whom they vote. I mean, what kind of concerns drive them?
Well, I guess there are several concerns which are relevant here, and I think part of the work that we need to do is really to unpack the different dimensions and show how they intersect. I think, well, speaking of Eastern Germany, the region where we find ourselves in here, I think one common concern is really the dynamic of reunification, German unification, the taking over of the West, the sense of neglect of Eastern German history, of Eastern German memory culture, for instance. I think there's a strong sense of not being sufficiently seen and understood. There are, of course, elements of fears of economic deprivation that might be lurking around. I mean, if we look at the statistics, it's not necessarily that people who are really from working class or despair precarious positions vote for the AfD, but there might be an element of the prospect of fear of economic downfall. So I think we have this general dynamic that, for instance, Jonathan Friedman has described as this double polarization, where people feel increasingly disentangled from the ruling elites, from the cosmopolitan elites, the political class in their country, but at the same time also against immigrants, against migrants, the foreigners within were seen as taking away. So I think there's this whole dynamic of the so-called refugee crisis 2015-16, where lots of migrants came to Germany. So I think it's this whole package of not trusting the elites, of sensing a certain sense of elitism, of superiority, where people feel that they are no longer addressed in the way they want to be addressed. And I think this whole package plays very nicely and dangerously together, because if you really engage, I had a wonderful master thesis of one of my students engaging with a anti-vaccination movement here in Halle. And if you talk to people there going to the demonstrations, it's a very diverse set of people: academics, medicines, alternative medicines, esoteric people, right-wing people, leftist activists, disillusioned peace activists, all kinds of people coming together, but they share a certain center of gravity around a certain sense of resentment, of dissatisfaction, of really being tired, the fatigue you mentioned earlier. I think this temporality, the sense of temporality, it's rather more temporalism. What is the ideology of time we have, right? Are we still in the middle of the time as it unfolds, or do we feel that we are left behind? Is time moving ahead and we are just the backyard, I think there's this kind of element which really is very productive politically, but also dangerous in certain ways.
That's very interesting. Because you mentioned temporality. It sounds very abstract, but actually if you think, very bodily, it is also very concrete. You just feel constantly behind, not only materially, but you look at the news and look at how people address as if you are always on the wrong side of the history. And so then, of course, you develop a certain perception about the politics and life in general. But I feel that you use this sounds as just taking temporality as example. It sounds very theoretical, abstract, but actually it is a very bodily sentiment and a feeling. I feel it's very productive because, as you mentioned, the anti-vaccine, there's no such thing as anti-vaccine people. Because if you look at who are there on the street that day shouting the same slogan, you found that you cannot have one bag and really put them in, all together, one basket, right? They're all different type of person. When talk about other issues, they all talk about very different opinions. But you also use gravity, and then because of circumstances, bring them together on this one particular issue. So I wonder whether or not you agree a kind of theoretical strategy we can develop, which is to depersonalize politics. And of course, we think, anthropology is about the people, so everything is done by people. You have to get the people right, who is doing what and which group, and classify them, etc. But sometimes I think like this far right or far left, when the politics become quite extreme, and then it's not necessarily so tightly tied to one group of people, and is something really emerging at circumstances, and may go away. So what does it mean is that we cannot blame a group of people to say you are doing that, but we should look at the circumstances, things like temporality and etc., that kind of feeling that give rise to that kind of opinions, which in turn means that on one hand, of course, they can be very dangerous because they're very volatile, unpredictable. But on the other hand, it also means it can go away quickly. It's not one group of people are committed their entire life for that cause. Am I correct? Is a match your observation?
No, I would fully agree. And I would really interested in disassemble that into different kinds of logics or modalities in which people find themselves, right? So I feel reminded of Tanja Luhrmann's classic study on neo-pagan witch cults in Cambridge, Persuasions of the Witchcraft, where she talks about people who engage in almost like a playful way with this kind of Wicca cults and so on. But then in the process of playfully engaging with rituals, start believing in it and create their own evidence, which proves the rightfulness of the belief. So they get, I think she calls it interpretive drift, right? Where people move and get drawn into it and increasingly see the world into narrow ways through the lens of that particular modality. And I think the interesting question that you raise is really, what are the conditions under which a certain sense of atmospheric agreement hardens and becomes more stable and more organizing and more structuring for the life of people. So who stays with the movement, so to speak, and who drifts away? And I think this is really an interesting dynamic to look at the sociology of that also. How does that really unfold? Why do certain people get drawn to these kind of dynamics, and why do other people feel, well, I'm no longer sticking with that, my atmosphere is changing? So I think it's really this fleeting atmospheric, affective dimensions that are also crucially important, right? And how do these harden into certain convictions that become so constitutive of certain identities that people cannot get away from them anymore?
So that's very interesting. And Olaf, you take a very brave move and to throw yourself into this atmosphere, a very dynamic atmosphere. As you mentioned, research itself is a performative act because the very fact you go there as a professor and you listen to them and at eye-to-eye level, itself is an act. So what's your experience? I mean, does this kind of the act, being there, talking to them, you feel actually does soften your interlocutors' the certain stance or open them up, and then actually they will feel that they are now seeing more and they have more dignity, therefore have some impacts in their views?
Well, that's a very, very broad question, and maybe it's too early to really come to an informed conclusion on that. I mean, first of all, it's not only me, of course, doing that, but it's my research team, it's my postdoc and PhD researchers, my master students that do that. And I think this is important. I think it's important to have a broad group of people engaging in multiple ways.
The skill matters, huh? You cannot be too individualistic.
It does. And it does what kind of status you have, right? Whether you go there as a professor or as some student. I think it's really important, and that's the challenge also, to find some cross-cutting ties, some commonalities which make you click, right? Because you need to somehow engage, right? So, I mean, going to these demonstrations on Monday evenings, for instance, of course you can walk along, but you need to start to get into conversation. So why are you here? What are you doing? Why are you interested? And I think one of the beauties and the virtues of anthropology is really also the possibility, if things go well, to make believable a sincere interest in the other, right? Whatever their position is, that we really want to engage, that we want to understand. And
we don't go there to criticize.
We don't go there primarily to criticize, although I would say, and I mean, that's what Mario and I have also been arguing about, we should be empathetically skeptic, but also agonistically confrontational. I think we shouldn't hide away from also being clear where we are politically positioned. But I think that the primary drive, of course, is to understand. And the hope is that the performance, the act of trying to understand, of getting in contact and saying, I'm really interested in who you are, what you have experienced, why you do what you do, why you feel what you're doing, can open up a stronger integration. I mean, that's a hope, I guess. But I think it's a heuristic hope that we should foster. I think that's what drives anthropology, but I think that's also one of our strengths in comparison to other methodologies, which are more distance, more survey-based and so on. I think we really have the chance to be there physically embodied in space and say, I'm here, I'm interested in you, show me who you are and how you want to be seen. I think that's an important act also in and of itself, not only for generating knowledge.
Yes, that's wonderful. And then do you have any thought about how you share the result of your research? I mean, we're talking about how, start the conversation and develop a certain concept. So we'll speak to their concerns and will not necessarily change their views, but at least make them think and rethink.
Well, I think, and that's a general trend, I think, in anthropology, and rightly so, over the past 10, 15 years, maybe. I think there's a stronger drive to collaborative research on the one hand, to have methodologies where research is not really, here's the group of researchers and they are the research subjects that are being studied and looked on from a hierarchy, so to speak, but rather engaging more interactively, doing co-research, as you are also very strongly fostering with the communities we are studied or interested in. The other question, of course, is to find ways of public engagement that transcend standard formats of the academy, right? I think it's still important to write academic articles, to write monographs, to have this sustained and nuanced and detailed debate for the community of experts that we form and foster. But I think it's also important, both in the framing of the question, but also in the presentation of the results, to find ways to frame anthropology in ways that are interesting and relevant beyond the academy. And this can take different formats, of course, different modalities, podcasts, it can take blog posts, it can take newspaper articles, it can take roundtables, public lecture series, engagements in theaters and so on. I think there are many ways, but obviously you still require, it's an interactive reciprocal process. If you cannot get the resonance from the community you want to reach, then so be it. I mean, what can you do? But I think there are ways, and anthropologists try hard to reach out in ways that are more easily acceptable and understandable and relevant for people beyond the academy.
Yes. And here, I think one of the biggest obstacles that we have faced when we experiment with the common concern approach actually is still theory. Because the academic research in general and anthropology in particular have been professionalized to such extent that the language we use, the language is very big in the concepts and the framework and etc. The tools that we rely on for thinking become rather bookish and complicated, and then very much worried about how we innovate knowledge, how we continue the tradition, and how we contribute to the library. Okay, there's 3 books on this part type, so I have the 4th one will be on different topic and etc. And so we feel there is not enough that kind of very plain language way of thinking, analyzing, capture what the people are worried about. For instance, like fatigue. And this fatigue is not only psychological fatigue, it means lots of things. This kind of a disappointment and a certain sense of masculinity is losing and all that. Capture that and then and unpack and then make our interlocutors feel that we are seeing them, as you said, and then also make them really think. And in order to do that, we also have to capture something they're already worried about, some pain in that. Everyone has some confusions, and they want to think that more clearly. Yeah, I don't know whether you have this feeling, and we feel that is quite because we can easily summarize or describe a phenomenon, then explain it from all kind of the theoretical apparatus we have. But how to really again speak to them? Sometimes they probably does not need a very systematic explanation of certain things scientifically, but they want to be addressed, their pain and etc. I don't know. Do you think? Do you have any advice how we could address this problem?
Well, advice, I'm not too sure, but I share your diagnostic. But I would say that this is part of the beauty of anthropology, because I think we have an inherent tension between a deep suspicion about well-received and established categories. I think there's a strong sense of autocriticism and ethnocentrism that might be buried into our categories. So I think in contrast to other disciplines, maybe we are more willing to throw overboard certain categories and rethink them, maybe excessively reinventing new terminologies in this process. But I think this is an epiphenomenon of the strong sense that we really try hard to understand what is really going on here, what I'm observing, and what are best ways of fitting concepts and tools to that situation in ways that make sense and are relevant. I mean, as you said earlier, I think anthropologists, if things go well, are interested in the common concerns that people have, but they are also struggling to try to translate it into more abstract categories and tools that help not only to capture that in words that the people can resonate with, but also provide a perspective that differs from the sensibilities into a certain sentiment or analysis that helps to open up new avenues of future practice. And I think that is a quite profound challenge. How do you stay experience near enough that people feel sufficiently seen, so that the people who read the ethnographies or hear you talk say, well, you understood what is really the issue for us, but then offer something which is not just a repetition of what they are saying, but phrasing it in ways and offering more comprehensive transsituational tools of analysis that are not contingent. I mean, give me any set of data and I give you one story of the other. That's not the challenge. The problem is, how do we select between different vocabularies of analysis in ways that plausibly justify that this is a privileged perspective helping to better understand what's going on. And I think this is really the challenge, because I think it's what we are supposed to be doing. That's the added value we bring to the table, a better and more profound analysis together, but possibly also against our research partners. But at the same time, staying close enough to what the people are experiencing so that they don't feel yet again lost, because they are kind of lost in translation in a certain way.
No, here actually I have some quite a positive experience because people want to read, for instance, our research, not only because they see themselves in the story, but also because the story does tell something they have not thought of. Everyone read with the intention they want to learn something that beyond what they know already. So that kind of actually desire of knowing a little more, I think is very commonly shared. So that is give me lots of actually encouragement. And the secondly, as you said, the elevating part in our approach. This is how the way we do it is through commoning. Is there's a concern, then the concern that lead to quite troubling consequences. But if you look at the concern and look deeper, then you find there's something very, very human there. The worry about the insecurity, the need to be seen, the basic sense of dignity, and that is quite it's a shared concern. But in these particular circumstances, it is channeled into something else. I think if we unpack that, they feel they are seen, but also they realized that how their very fundamental human need is being manipulated into something else. And that probably is not necessary in our image, is elevated to some higher level, but simply to spread it wider. But in this doing so, probably also it gives depth to our analysis. Yeah.
I agree. Two things maybe that come to my mind. One is, I think it very much depends on what the kind of people are we are doing research with. I mean, in some settings, and my understanding from reading your work is that you're working with people in China and elsewhere who have a certain sensibility, but also a certain interest in getting some suggestions on how to deal with that. So there's possibly a certain openness towards this kind of suggestions, whereas in other contexts, maybe with research partners that we describe as normative others, there might be less willingness to be excited about the analysis we offer, right? So I think they might still, if things go well, get a sense that, yes, you rightly represented our concerns, but we disagree with your analysis, right? And that leads me to the second point. I think it's also important, obviously, that our work is multidirectional in its audiences and the publics that we're going to address, right? So the immediate research partners is one audience, but obviously there are also other readers, the wider society and so on. So for instance, to come back to my research in South Africa and this constitutional amendment debate about expropriation without compensation, that was a selling point of left populist parties in South Africa who said, well, land reform is going too slow. We need to push. We finally need to find a solution which will break through and rapidly speed up the process. And amending the constitution to allow for expropriation without compensation will play the trick. That was basically the discourse. And many of the potential beneficiaries of land reform, people that I do research with, were very excited about that. So you had public hearings and hundreds, thousands of people showed up and made aired their opinion and so on. And there was a very strong support on the ground for that. I can understand that sensibility, but analytically I disagree, because in my understanding, and I share that sensibility with many of my colleagues, if you do expropriation without compensation, paying nothing, the case will immediately go to court. It will be stuck there pending for years and decades. It will cost the state a lot of money. And cases in which you will really be capable of not paying anything will be very rare. So I think it's more of a smokescreen. And if you are truly interested in radical transformation, I think rather than changing the constitution, it would be better to finally implement it, right? So for instance, taxation, right? If you introduce a wealth tax, right? Which in South Africa would make a lot of sense because it's one of the most unequal societies in the world, where the richness and the wealth of the nation is concentrated in very, very few hands, right? And where the electorate, most of the people who vote in South Africa are so poor that they don't even pay any taxes, right? So you would have the electorate, the vote, to support the politics of a wealth tax. It would be much more radical to use the law, taxation law, to transform and redistribute money at a much larger scale than just to punish individual landowners, right? So this would be a situation, that's actually what we did politically. To give you an example of how we've been working on that is to study the process of land reform, to study the expropriation without compensation debate, but then also to make political interventions to parliament, to political parties, to the wider audience, to give TV interviews, and to make the case, well, if you want to have a truly radical transformation in South Africa, then take the money from the richest and redistribute it at much larger scale than to focus only on one landowner and expropriate this particular guy from this land without paying. You can reach a much larger scale and be much faster without changing the law. So this is not something that the people I study would necessarily agree with. They feel, many of them feel and felt that expropriation without compensation will play the trick. So there can be a possibility for disagreement. You see what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
So we take seriously the concern and despair and dissatisfaction with the slowness of the process. But I do disagree with the analysis of what kind of political measures would be appropriate to transform that. And I think that is also something we need to do. And the audiences we study differ with regard to the willingness of accepting our interpretation. But as long as they feel sufficiently seen in their concerns, I think we are doing a good job. And then we are in the conversation. Then we can have an argument. Some people may say, well, taxation is a good thing. Others would say, well, no, let's go for expropriation without compensation. And then the ball is running.
Yes. Well, that is a very powerful story, and it's wonderful. And it really demonstrates your idea of that the politically troubling time can be intellectually affordance, moment of affordance. Thank you very much, Olaf.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining us, and see you next time.